to prepare our citizens for this great day when we will all step up on this rock of salvation together. And we are going to continue that process tonight. We have a young man from New York, Temple 82, who has spent many, many hours, years, studying and researching and preparing to bring this information to us tonight. It is by divine guidance that he come to us tonight. Because we did not go seeking this brother. But one day he appears. Allah knew what we needed and he gave us what we needed. So I'm going to bring forth to you tonight a young man who spoke here, 3 times already, been well received, twice, thank you, Mother. He has been well received, his lecture has been very enlightening. He erased a lot of the myths that we have about our Constitution and about the way we are being governed in this land. And you know, the prophet said the way he was going to uplift the fallen sons and daughters of North America was to teach them to be themselves. But if you don't know the rules of the game, what the correct rules of the games are, then how can you participate on a fair level? How can you be what you really are? Because the rules of the game dictate that you be something different than what you are. But Allah realized this dilemma. And he sent us a young man to bring us some understanding, to bring us the light, to uncover the matrix, to bring us to that point of salvation. I have been so thrilled since he's been here that I really can't find the words to express it. So without further ado, all the way from New York City, the dynamic, the charismatic, the knowledgeable, Khabir Uriel Bey, Islam. Islam. Once again, it's a pleasure to be here, to see you brothers and sisters, to be able to share, some of the information that I've been blessed to come by. First, I have to say all praises to Allah, the great God of the universe. Give honor to the Prophet, Noble Drew Ali, founder of the Moorish Science Temple of America. I give honor to our national flag, seal, and Constitution, of which we have been talking about for the last couple of weeks, going over that supreme law of the land. And contrary to popular belief, the Constitution is still the supreme law of the land. Despite, as I said, popular opinion about the Constitution being suspended, this, that, and the other, and as I mentioned before, that there has been no amendment to abridge, abolish, or again suspend any of the constitutional mandates, provisions, or prohibitions. And in order for us to really understand this, we have to know where we fit into the scheme of things.
constitutionally speaking. And just to briefly reiterate, for those of you who weren't here, and as the brother stressed before, it is imperative, it is paramount that you understand, that you know who you are. It is imperative that in knowing who you are and knowing what your nationality is, to proclaim that nationality to the world, openly and notoriously. Because if you think that this isn't important, if you're under the impression that it's not important at all, well then consider yourself to be in perpetual slavery, a displaced person with no rights to be respected, and subject to the abuses that the citizens care to bestow upon you. Now, we talked about a lot of things. We talked about the bankruptcies. We talked about taxation, or so-called taxes, and the unconstitutionality of the Internal Revenue Service, who are constantly imposing taxes on many of our Moorish Americans. Their subjects, of course, namely Negroes, and all of those 14th Amendment persons within the purview and operation of the 14th Amendment. They have every right to tax, to impose, to fatigue. Any other demands, any rules, regulations, etc., they have every right to impose. But I just want to be clear on a few things. And even though, yes, for the last couple of weeks I've been talking about Constitution, this, that, and the other, and a lot of people, of course, have been saying, well, you know, why is he going on and on and on about this Constitution? Because as far as the courts are concerned, we're operating under the Uniform Commercial Code, which, of course, as many of you may recall, I went into great detail about that having no constitutional foundation, the Uniform Commercial Code, regardless as to what agreements the said U.S. Corporation has entered into for the purposes of bankruptcy, or to administer public policy of bankruptcy. As far as that goes, constitutionally speaking, it has no place. But I just want to say that I hear a lot of people talking about, nonetheless, constitutional rights. Let me say, first of all, that there's no such thing as constitutional rights. Now, why would he be saying that when for the last few weeks he's been talking about Constitution, about constitutional liberties, etc.? Well, in order for you to have a constitutional right would imply that someone or something or some entity has granted you some privileges or has awarded you something. So let's get an understanding about that. So for those of you who do know who you are in terms of being Moorish Americans, and as far as being United States citizens, all right, and being within the constitutional fold, namely the United States Constitution, make no mistake or no error, because you will get jammed up by saying or stating that you have constitutional rights. Again, a constitutional right is an enumeration. An enumeration, again, is something that is granted or given. Okay? In the Latin, it is referred to as enumeratio. Enumeratio infirmat. Enumeratio infirmat regulam incassibus non enumeratis. Meaning that enumeration, or an enumeration, in the rule of cases, or shall I say the disfirmed rule in cases that are not enumerated. Now, I know that sounds a little confusing, but what I mean is that all of the rules, procedures of which the courts have been functioning under, of what would appear to be enumerated authorities, okay, and so forth, in terms of the legislative authority, in fact, as we have come to find out, is not. Why? Because they're operating under colorable jurisdiction and procedure, namely the so-called equity, which the Constitution does make a provision for equity, as I mentioned before, but not the equity law and jurisdictional procedure of which they're functioning, okay? But again, as I said, because an enumeration is something of which is granted or given, all right, in this case, the people giving Congress or all of the respective branches of government certain, if you will, authorities to function are considered to be enumerated. However, they have taken it upon themselves to step outside of that so that they can do what they want. And that was only because, again, as I said before, we've been sleeping at the helm. All right? And as I mentioned before, if at some point I'm going a little too fast, feel free to tell me to slow down or to repeat something, and I'll be glad to repeat it. All right? Because the main purpose of my being here is to not only disseminate information, but to inseminate this information, so that you can inscribe it into your hearts and mind in divine conformity with this Circle 7. Because without this, none of the other stuff matters. Islam. All right? But I will go on to say that in terms of, or as far as constitutional rights are concerned, as I said, there's no such thing, but there is such thing as constitutionally protected rights. Big difference. Why? Because your rights were not enumerated. Your rights, as I said before, are divine rights, which are unalienable rights, which of course no one can give or grant. All right, so for all of the law, etc., that you might be attempting to execute in any of the Union States courts or said Union States courts, please do not use the term or terminology that I'm asserting my constitutional right, because you have none. You only have constitutionally protected rights, and that is only for those citizens within the Constitution fold, namely United States citizens. All right? Good. The other thing is that I mentioned something to the effect of there being no such word or thing as federal in the Constitution. Right? Good. However, I never expatiated on why. I mean, even though, of course, throughout your daily lives or whenever some agency of the state or county, etc., is trying to enforce some rule, they tell you, well, federal regulation says you must do this, that, or the other, blah, 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 right? But the reason why there is no such word in the Constitution as federal is because, well, it would clearly expose some people. And if you do a little research, you'll find that federal comes from the Latin term foederatus, F-O-E-D-E-R-A-T-U-S, with a macron over the A. And foederatus, or federal, means, or simply means, allied to Rome. So, for many of you who have for a number of years suspected that, well, I know that, Rome and the Vatican and this, that, and the other, they're behind this, and I know that they're concealing some secrets about our history, blah, blah, blah. Well, you weren't too far off the mark. But as I said before, your language reveals and unveils a lot of information about the goings-on of this said federal government and of all of these said governments of the world, which, for the record, that all of the members of the United Nations, or said nations of the United Nations, who are operating under the United Nations Charter and the International Monetary Fund policy, which is a U.S. International monetary policy, as I mentioned before, are, for the record, federal. Every last said government of every last said nation is federal. The only national government, truthfully speaking, is the Moorish government and the Moorish nation. Islam. Okay, I really want you to understand this. I really want you to get this. This is really important. All right? Every last government who are members of the United Nations, who are operating under the U.S. International Monetary Policy, which is a public policy for the international bankers, as I mentioned before, are all federal. Not just the federal corporate United States of America and its said government, but every last said government throughout the world, with the exception of the Moorish nation. All right? Islam. To take it a step further, therefore, that would mean that every court within this land and outside of this land, across the globe, are administering a public policy for someone else who's considered to be a creditor, right? Namely, again, the international bankers. But the international banker never has to make an appearance in any of the said courts. Why? Because they have these said agencies and the lawyers of whom work for many of these institutions and agencies protecting them. Right? So that's why, for those of you who are, how shall I say, pretty well informed and will have the gumption to question the court as to what the cause and nature of the action is, well, as pursuant to but not limited to the Sixth Amendment of the Constitution, it is imperative for you to state or ask what the true nature and cause of the action is. Why? Because, well, if you ask what the true nature and cause of the action is, well then, there has to be a true creditor, right? Or a true plaintiff, or the true party, right? Because as I said before, everything is operating under debtor-creditor law, with that being the controlling law, all right? And I just want to add something else, just for the record, concerning these court appearances, etc., that when they say you have been charged with burglary or you've been charged with whatever it is, okay, that, well, I have one question. That is, what do you mean by charges? Then, of course, they'll say, well, what do you mean? Well, what I mean is, in order for me to be charged with anything would imply that I have a debt. Right? So that means that someone, or some magistrate, has to rephrase, or prosecution, or said prosecution, have to rephrase their statements for the record. Because I have no debt. Why do you think when individuals come out of jail, they talk about, well, I paid my debt to society? Whether they committed the crime or not. Why? Because they have been conditioned into the mindset of being a debtor. Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. All right? But I am not a debtor. So this is important for us to understand. All right? Islam. And as I mentioned before, well, again, if there's no indictment, or you have no presentment as such, which was signed by a so-called magistrate or jury, coupled with a warrant, as pursuant to but not limited to the Fourth Amendment, well then, get out of here. I'm not hearing you. Noli me tangere. Get your hands off. So, if I am wrongfully kidnapped, or so-called arrested, shackled and beat down and whatever else, well, everybody has their day in court. And the first thing that I'm going to do outside of declaring myself, pledging my allegiance as a United States citizen and a people of the United States to this national flag, seal, and Constitution, and letting him or her know that they have a constitutional oath to uphold, defend, and protect that Constitution, because governments and the respective officials are there for one purpose and one purpose only, and that is to protect the birthrights of the people. So if they're not doing that, well then, what are they doing? But again, you must know that you are the people. So my question, or statement, nota bene, opere cetato constituti lex, res quintas, emendito criminatonis, necesse est sum facio in propria persona. Which only means that, listen, as I said before, if there's no indictment, which is criminatonis, and I prefaced my statement with, for the record, nota bene. Right? It's imperative that you do that, because then it puts the court reporter on notice. And it's putting the magistrate, or even at this point, said magistrate, or person, or individual, for which, as the brother pointed out, I am not, because I am the people. We are the people. So, again, this is my question to him or her, because they have no constitutional authority. As I said, it was waived, forfeited, etc. All right? I think the brother had a question before I go any further. Yes.
Okay, so basically you're saying that we need to learn the rules and regulations, learn the rules of the law enforcement for case one, court systems, lawyers or whatever.
Well, I'm not saying that.
In your defense, I'm saying in your own defense.
Yeah, in your defense, well, it's not even so much about the rules and regulations, because rules and regulations are not what you're dealing with. You're dealing with the law, right? So, rules and regulations have nothing to do with me. I just want to make certain that they're functioning within the boundaries of the rules and regulations, if you will, of which we established for them to function. Because the Constitution was created for the sole purpose of limitations, or governmental limitations. All right? Were there any other questions before I go any further? All right? So, as I said, it's really important for you to assert this. Yes?
Getting back to the Sixth Amendment,
that, what is it, I'm sorry?
There ain't no injured party.
Yeah, corpus delicti, yes. Well, truth be told, yes. But again, like I said, you must establish who you are first and foremost. And the reason being, which is nationality, right? First issue at law, etc. Because if that is not established, well then, who are you? Identify yourself. Why? Because first thing you're doing when you ask what the cause and nature of the action is, and you say, well, or even I want to know what the true nature and cause of the action is, I want to know who the true creditor is, well then you're asking them to, or someone to identify themselves for bringing the action against you, right? So therefore, if I'm coming in there with the brass, if you will, of demanding that somebody, identify themselves, then I must identify myself, right? But like I said, it's not strange at all that there is never any identification of the true character and principle of the action of which is being brought against you, which is being brought against you under a bankruptcy proceeding.
Okay, sometimes they'll say the state is the one that you offend.
That the state what?
The state is the one that offends.
The federal part of the state. The state is the
They'll
federal part.
try to put that on.
Okay, well, but now let's look at the so-called docket number, and let's look at what's on the document itself in terms of what the charges are. They'll say who? The state of New York or Georgia or whatever versus Joe Blow, right? But now, if we're talking about the state of New York or the state of Georgia or the state of anything else, we're not talking about the republic, are we? We're talking about someone or something or some entity who is taking on something or the appearance of being a damaged party, but they're not the damaged party. They can't be, wherein someone is bringing to the forefront the constitutional questions. Why? Because if I'm bringing forth constitutional questions in a constitutional court, which becomes constitutional the minute I step into the court, well, then that means now that they must function in a constitutional capacity. And they have to put aside any so-called obligation agreements or whatever that they might be functioning under, right? So, like I said, you take precedence and priority, but you have to make it known as such. Otherwise, they're just going to presume that, well, you're nobody. Islam.
Islam, I think should be made clear that the states existed before the federal corporation, and that the states established themselves long before the federal jurisdiction. And we're not taught that in America. We're taught that the federal is the first priority in government. That was not the case. The federal came later.
Yes.
If we do that to be the fact, then we will look at law in an entirely different light.
Yes. But you have to understand that and that's a very good point, but it's important to understand that when they filed, you had the U.S. bankruptcy, and when they filed for bankruptcy, they filed on behalf of the states. Why? Because the states entered into a contract or agreement with the said federal government. So therefore, when they filed, well, the states automatically became as insolvent as the said federal government itself, which thereby, at that time, became the said several states. You see? But now, even though the states had established their so-called states' constitutions, etc., and were functioning under the republic, well, even so, what was the purpose then of establishing the Constitution? The Constitution was to, yes, make provisions for the states in which the states were, how they would function, in addition to the provisions that were made in their states' constitutions, right? But the Constitution, namely the United States Constitution, was what? Supreme law of the land. So that meant that the states' constitutions, for all intent and purpose, took a back seat. But they were upheld as long as they were in conformity with the United States Constitution. But like I said, when they stepped outside of that contract, they stepped outside of all of it. Yes.
What you stated that, okay, like ignorance of the law, as far as not knowing the difference between state and federal, would that be considered, I'm saying, because many people would not know that federal means something else.
Mhm. Yeah, I understand that, and that's a good point, and I agree to some extent, but unfortunately, it doesn't change the truth. That just that's what it is. So if they're under the impression or they want to believe or think or be led to believe that, well, federal is, in the context of the United States, it's lawful and all these other things, well, it's not. However, before I go any further, were there any other questions? Okay. All right, so it's really important, again, to establish who you are first and foremost, before you go any further, before you say anything. Because make no mistake, they are looking for the first mistake. You incriminating yourself. Yes.
First thing is, okay, so you're saying before you get arrested or anything, I'm saying the body of individuals coming around you, police, sheriff, whatever, you should state who you are and what your relationship as far as the state, the United States of America, or what's your nationality, so they'll know how to deal with you accordingly before you go to the court system.
Well,
That's important to me.
you can make that statement if you want, but now, in many instances, because they're operating under some statutes and codes and rules, etc., it won't necessarily stop them from taking you in. But again, like I said, everybody has a day in court. So when you have your day in court, well then, you are to make those statements. Why? Because they say, again, anything can and will be used against you. Right? Yes. So, I'm sorry, Brian. Go ahead.
Myself, I went to court first time, and on the paper they made me sign, they told me to sign for TDC, United States Commerce Code, 1-207. After going to court again, I presented myself as asking the other people what were their jurisdiction and their authority. The two officers, it was 4 in all, but there was 2 that showed up. So what do I do as far as like if I'm already in the process of being in court and I'm still trying to get them to understand my nationality and that I'm a free sovereign citizen?
Well, first of all, let's get an understanding. You are not free unless you know how to be free. That's number one. Number two, this UCC stuff, leave it alone, throw it out the window, because it has no place in constitutional law. When you start making these statements concerning the Uniform Commercial Code are incriminating statements. For you to be mentioning or making statements about, well, I'm a Moorish American and this, that, and the other, and I'm not subject to your jurisdiction, blah, 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 all day long. And then you turn around and talk about UCC, this, that, and the other. That's for them. Has nothing to do with you. What was the purpose as to why the Uniform Commercial Code was created? It was created, as I said before, by the National Conference of Commissioners of Uniform State Laws, right, and the American Law Institute, for the sole purpose of, yes, commerce, but the administration and the implementation of bankruptcy public policy, so that all of the states would be in conformity, criminal conformity and uniformity since 1963, even though they started attempting to put this on the market back in 38 and 40, right? Which is no coincidence that this happened at least 6 weeks or so after Kennedy was assassinated. But that's a whole nother issue. But what I'm saying is, stay away from the Uniform Commercial Code. Now, if you want to read the code as I said before and deal with the language, then so be it. But only, and please, don't take this as an insult, but I'm only here to tell the truth. Only idiots and deaf, dumb, and blind use those codes. Right? Just like a lot of people get up in court talking about, I'm going to use a lot, I'm saying I'm going to use some Masonic symbols. That don't mean anything. But what if, I mean, let's just say for all intent and purpose, the magistrate or whomever is up there is not a member or a fraternal guildsman. Right? Or doesn't belong to the so-called Eastern Stars or the Masonic Lodge or whatever. So what does that mean? In fact, in most cases, in most instances, before you can even indicate as such, well, what are you told to do before you do or say anything? Generally is, well, step inside the bar and hands behind your back, and the minute you make any gestures or anything, well, you know what the court officers are looking to do, right? So I'm just saying that what you state on and for the record goes a long way, and it goes a lot further than standing there doing this all day. Are you a mute? Do you need an interpreter or something, or somebody to come in and speak for you? All right? So it's important to understand that. Okay, but again, I can't stress enough, leave the UCC alone. Because when you start using that, that only tells them that you not only acknowledge the bankruptcy, but you're consenting to it. And if you're supposed to be the people functioning constitutionally, as it were, or you're trying to establish justice in that court, well then, what are you doing? What are you saying? Are you saying that you're part of the, the international policy agreements and all of this? Huh? Because that's what you're telling them. And the first thing they're going to say to you is, well, can't you get something from one of your representatives or somebody at the UN? Or in fact, before I even go any further or proceed with this case, well, you're going to have to bring me a document or something from the United Nations. And until then, well, you know what? Better still, remand him or her into custody. So, this is really important for you to understand. And the other thing is, well, as in the case of the brother who was just talking to me, he said, well, when they kidnapped you and they took you in, so-called arrested you, well, they went through a procedure. What was that procedure? Before they did anything, they said, okay, Guy, listen, Guy, we're going to have to, going to take some fingerprints and photographs, and, you'll be out here in a snap, and this is not a serious thing, anything to get you to comply, all right? But you have to understand that where in the Constitution does it say anything about fingerprints and photographs? Where? You see, this is what I'm talking about. But when you start going into, well, UCC, this, that, and the other, well, first of all, when you start that, prior to even stepping foot in the courtroom, most of the said officers don't know anything about that. And if they do, they're not going to say anything about that, and they're not going to engage. Because they're going to tell you, well, listen, Guy, I'm not a lawyer, and, I'm not really legally qualified for that. Which they're telling the truth. as far as that goes, yes.
I have a question for the mouthpiece. Does everyone understand that when you start talking to a judge, magistrate in their official capacity, you initiate the contract? Does everyone understand that? You initiate a contract. Right there, when you stand in front of them, you start talking to them, that's you're creating a contract as you speak. So what he's telling you is, hey, you speak from a person of authority as the people, okay? That you're running this contract, you're running this show. And you're putting them in check. That's what he's trying to tell you. That's true. Okay? Anybody in the official capacity, when you start speaking to them, you initiate a contract. It's a verbal contract. That's why they tell you anything that you say can be and will be used against you. Do you understand? I'm sorry,
Islam. And so again, like I said, I'm not taking any fingerprints or photographs. Why? Because the fingerprints are for what? The police department to have or assume a jurisdiction. The photograph is for corrections to assume a jurisdiction. Follow? So they know they have none until such time that you give in or you acquiesce. All right? Islam. See, so, and the whole thing is, now what they're going to do, though, don't think that you're just going to say, well, I'm not going to fingerprint, I'm not going to photograph, I'm not going to do anything, and it's going to be all fine, well, and good. They'll do everything they can in that 72-hour period to get you to comply. That means that they have to bring some guys in, as big as this brother over here, talking about, you're going to fingerprint, you're going to photograph, I'm telling you. Right? Matter of fact, I even have a friend who some years ago was arrested because he was trying to sell socks. You know what I'm saying? To feed his family or whatever. He didn't have a job at the time or whatever. But he knew who he was. Right? He was a Moorish American. And, well, anyway, make a long story short, when he was in the dungeons, as I call them, they said, well, listen, you're going to have to fingerprint and photograph. And he kept telling them, listen, I'm not going to do that. Why? Because I'm not going to incriminate myself. And I'm not giving you any jurisdiction and or authority. So anyway, they had this big guy come in and strangle him, or attempt to strangle him, and beat him down in the whole nine, right? So while he was doing this, they took photographs, which didn't make any sense at all. Because when the photograph came out, you know, one of these Polaroid things, whatever, you know, the guy said, listen, that's really not going to look too good. I mean, that's clearly threat, duress, and coercion, right? So, you know, I'm just saying that regardless as to what they do to intimidate you, you know, because they will, I'm telling you. But I will say, and I'll reiterate that after 72 hours, or in the 3-day period, what's going to happen is they're going to take you to the so-called state Supreme Court, and then you will explain to the said magistrate why you didn't fingerprint or why you didn't photograph. Okay? And I can think of one particular case law, not that I have to use case law. Why? Because I can proceed sub silentio, right? Which really is constitutional, if you will. But there's a particular case law called Gow versus Bingham, particularly dealing with the New York City Police Department and why they cannot fingerprint or photograph any so-called defendant for the purposes of creating a record or keeping a dossier on the individual against their will and without their lawful consent. All right? But, like I said, you don't have to rely on that because the Constitution is paramount. Right? So, I just want to go on to something else very quickly concerning this issue about the Moroccan treaties. Okay? Because Over the last few years, I've been hearing a lot about treaty this, treaty that, treaty the other. Let's get an understanding. It is not your treaty per se. Why do I say that? The treaty, because it says it's a treaty between the Sultan of Morocco, right, and the said United States of America. But now, whether the provinces of Morocco were here at that time, or they were somewhere else, even on another galaxy, you were not in the agreement per se. You were not one of the parties, shall I say. It says a treaty or agreement between who? The Sultan of Morocco, which is a delegate of the people, and the said United States of America. Now, though it does make mention of Moors in that treaty, it is not per se your treaty. And the reason why I say that is because in Article 6, which is in conformity with Article 6 of the United States Constitution, no coincidence, it says Moors not subject to these dominions, meaning either or. So it's just like if, let's say the brother Eniola and myself enter into an agreement, and for clarity purposes, just so that all parties understand what is being stated in the contract, I make mention of the sister here. We're going to do so and so and so by Sister Emerisia Bay's house. She's not a party, but we simply made mention of her, again, for clarity purposes. That's all. But this was one of the reasons why, when they filed for bankruptcy, then they went on to, stack the Supreme Court, or Roosevelt went to stack the Supreme Court for the purposes of having a case, or some sort of case law to legitimize the bankruptcy, namely Erie versus Tompkins, or Erie Railroad versus Tompkins, 1938. It was to change or to destroy all precedents, all appearance, and the statute of law itself, namely the statutes at large, right? Because this is where the treaties are recorded. In the United States Statutes at Large, Foreign Treaties, right? 1778 to 1845, pages 100 to 105. All right, so that's why I'm saying be very careful when you go around talking about, well, we have treaties, this, that, and the other, because like I said, when they perverted the statutes at large by virtue of how they're functioning now and the so-called colorable procedure of law, that meant that they dishonored the treaties as well. But make no mistake, they are still bound. But I'm just saying be careful. All right? So, are there any other questions before I go any further? Okay. Oh, also, I just wanted to mention about the tax situation. Well, in 1966, something occurred, or a particular act, which you can research or check it out under the Federalist Papers, number 44, or you can even do some research about it in Title 18 of the United States Code Annotation, Section 331 and 332, and a case known as U.S. versus Marigold, which talks about, it's the Federalist Papers, number 31, not 44. 44 is dealing with the debasing of the constitutional gold and silver. The Federal Tax Lien Act of 1966 can be found in the Federalist Papers, number 31. All right? And this particular Tax Lien Act was to place all of the taxing as well as the monetary system under the so-called Uniform Commercial Code. Okay? So I'm just saying that for documentary evidence, but I also want to go on to say that, Moors who are dealing with this law or making, or attempting to deal with this law and assert their rights and this, that, and the other in the courts, you really need to stop dipping and dodging like a runaway slave. Even though you're walking around with the fairs and all of that, talking about I'm not subject. But what I mean by that is, you must establish justice with the Constitution. All right? You must do that. So, all I'm saying is that when you start getting into anything else, or dipping and dodging and all of these other things, it's just not going to happen. I'm saying that you must disclose evidence of the fraud. You have to do this. If you don't, well then, you can look forward to spending some time in downstate or wherever else they want to send you. Yes.
Okay, when you're saying, okay, we're not stating, okay, that you're incarcerated at the time. Are you saying that to directly challenge them with the Constitution?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, this is what I'm saying. But I'm also saying that, listen, as far as I'm concerned, in other words, it's just like they have no problems with prima facie evidence at best, meaning something opposite or other than substantive, because if you're talking about, or if you're raising constitutional questions, or you're bringing forth constitutional issues, then that means that you are bringing forth substantive evidence, right? Along with all of the other documentary evidence or things that I may have mentioned, which help to support that. But what I'm saying is that, as far as I'm concerned, in disclosing evidence of the fraud, there is absolutely no way that any branch of government, any so-called official or whomsoever else, or said official, can obfuscate the inescapable truth, right? The inescapable truth about their sticky hand history of numismatical pecuniary foul play. When it is the officials, whether it be the said members of the House of Representatives in Congress, or the said members of the House of the Senate in Congress, or anyone else, that it is you, not you per se, but you, who have taken the oath, and of which now is your curse for having violated such an oath. And no priest's absolution or amount of incompetence will save or excuse you from prosecution for your treasonous acts against the people. That means you're functioning in the capacity of a prosecutor. You see? Yeah.
For the question I was asking, is this before or after? I'm saying we're not talking about after they incarcerate you. We're talking about the official act of actually going into court, talking with, well, I guess I'm not saying it right. It's still not being incorporated. Not being incarcerated, but to actually go in court to talk on a level with them about that, to challenge their authority, but not to be per se a criminal or not to be charged as a criminal. Am I kind of getting?
Yeah. Well, you have to understand, it's a criminal proceeding. So they're going to proceed as though you are a criminal, and they're going to charge you as though you are a criminal, right? But again, the burden of proof is on them. But what I'm saying is that they're going to proceed, like I said, as though you are guilty. But you have to turn the table. You have to, again, establish justice. If you don't, well, then you know the rest. there any other questions before I go any further? Yes.
So now, like, let's say you made a couple of mistakes. What can you do to combat those mistakes that you made, like, before you try to do?
Yeah. Well, we talked about that the other night briefly. Something known as nunc pro tunc, which can be found in the Black's Law Dictionary, which basically means, like, let's say if you signed your name to some agreement or you consented to something unknowingly, right? Well, then you can exercise a remedy afterward, saying that, well, listen, you know, I don't know, I was under some kind of duress, or I was simply in error. N-U-N-C-P-R-O-T-U-N-C. Nunc pro tunc. Or even something else known as vindicta, which deals with centripetal and centrifugal force. Why do I say that? Because vindicta, which in a sense deals with habeas corpus, or being restrained, or some kind of restraint, or so-called governmental restraint, again, of which, as I said before, you, the people, determine what that restraint is. But what I'm saying is, vindicta deals with proclaiming who you are, or someone, like I said, who's being held in captivity, if you will, or so-called slavery, right? As well as I said, it also deals with the pendulum, because it deals with weight and counterpoison. And why do I say that? Because now we're dealing with what? Justice. The two-edged sword. Yes.
Oh, yeah. Are you familiar with the writ of Khabir Novus Era? Am I pronouncing it right?
I'm sorry?
It's found in the Black Law Dictionary. Writ of Khabir Novus Era.
Yes.
I might not be pronouncing it right.
Yeah.
I'm not sure.
But if you're in error of something, and you want to correct that error,
Okay.
yes. Also, just for the record, what is this? Fatuas praesumptor, qui in proprio nomine erat. That only simply means that a man is presumed to be, or anyone is presumed to be simple, if they make a mistake or error in name. That means you must be in proper person all the time. Right? We know this to be true by virtue of what Dred Scott decision, right? Dred Scott versus Sanford, 1857. So, if you do make any errors or mistakes of sorts in any other way, shape, form, the one thing you definitely do not want to make a mistake in is letting it be known as to who you are, nationally speaking. All right? Totum populi corpus. Yes. Islam.